What if I told you there's a Bible story where a piece of iron floated? Not metaphorically, not symbolically, literally floated on water like a cork bobbing on the surface of a pond. You've heard of Moses parting the Red Sea. You know about David slaying Goliath. The story of Daniel in the lion's den rolls off your tongue, but tucked away in the pages of 2 Kings chapter 6 lies one of the most overlooked miracles in all of Scripture. A miracle so humble, so seemingly insignificant, that most people skip right over it without a second thought. Yet this brief narrative, comprising only 6 verses, contains profound truths about faith, responsibility, and the God who cares about the smallest details of our lives. During the prophetic ministry of Elisha, miracles often happened in ordinary, almost mundane situations. While his predecessor, Elijah, called down fire from heaven and raised the dead, Elisha's ministry was marked by intimate, practical interventions, healing bitter water, multiplying oil for a widow's debt, and yes, making iron float. This story is brief in scripture but rich in meaning, a testament to faith in small things, a reminder that no problem is too insignificant for divine intervention. In a world where we're conditioned to believe that God only shows up for the spectacular, the floating axe head whispers a different truth. Sometimes, the most profound miracles happen in the most ordinary moments of our lives. The sun cast long shadows across the Jordan River Valley as another day began in the divided kingdom of Israel. It was a time of political turmoil and spiritual awakening, when the northern kingdom teetered between apostasy and revival, largely dependent on the influence of God's prophets. This was the era of Elisha's ministry, roughly 850 BC, decades after the dramatic departure of his mentor Elijah in a chariot of fire. The sons of the prophets, a community of disciples and spiritual students gathered around Elisha, had been growing steadily. These weren't prophets in the sense of fortune tellers or mystics, but rather men dedicated to learning God's ways, studying his word, and serving under the guidance of established prophets like Elisha. Think of them as a biblical seminary, a community of faith where young men came to deepen their understanding of the divine and prepare for ministry. Their current living situation had become cramped and inadequate. What had once been sufficient space for a handful of devoted followers was now bursting at the seams. The community was thriving, and with growth came practical challenges. They needed more room, more space to gather, to learn, to live together in their pursuit of spiritual wisdom. "The place where we dwell with you is too small for us," they told Elisha one morning, their voices carrying the respectful deference due their teacher, but also the practical urgency of their situation. It wasn't a complaint so much as an observation, a statement of fact that required action. Their solution was both practical and communal. They would go to the Jordan River region and gather timber to construct a larger dwelling place. The Jordan Valley was known for its trees, sycamores, willows, and other varieties that could provide the lumber they needed. It was honest work, the kind of labour that built both character and community as they worked side by side toward a common goal. "Let us go to the Jordan," they proposed, "and let every man take a beam from there, and let us make a place where we may dwell." The plan was simple, straightforward, and entirely reasonable. They weren't asking for a miracle or divine provision dropped from heaven. They were willing to work, to sweat, to use their hands and their backs to meet their need. Elisha, ever the encouraging leader, gave his blessing. Go. But their invitation touched his heart. "Please consent to go with your servants." They wanted their teacher among them, not just giving permission but participating in their labour. And Elisha, who could have remained comfortably behind while his students did the hard work, responded with characteristic humility, "I will go." So the small company set out for the Jordan, tools in hand, ready to transform their vision into reality. The Jordan River, had witnessed countless biblical events. It was here that Joshua led the Israelites into the Promised Land, where the priest's feet touched the water and it parted just as the Red Sea had done for Moses. It was in these very waters that centuries later John the Baptist would immerse Jesus Christ himself. But on this particular day, there would be no grand procession, no miraculous river crossing, just a group of dedicated men heading to the riverside to cut timber, their hearts full of purpose and their hands ready for honest labour. The Jordan Valley stretched before them, its banks lined with the trees they needed, its waters flowing steadily toward the Dead Sea, carrying with it the silt and sediment of the highlands above. None of them could have imagined that before the day was through, these same waters would become the stage for a miracle that defied every law of physics they understood. The ordinary was about to become extraordinary, but for now it was simply another day of work in service to God and community. The work began in earnest as the sun climbed higher in the morning sky. The sounds of labour filled the Jordan Valley, the rhythmic thud of axes biting into wood, the crack and groan of falling timber, the calls of men coordinating their efforts. It was satisfying work, the kind that produces visible results and builds camaraderie among those who share the burden. Among the workers was a young man whose name history has forgotten, but whose predicament would echo through the ages. Unlike some of his fellow students who had brought their own tools, he had needed to borrow an axe for the day's work. In ancient Israel, this was no small matter. Iron tools were precious commodities, expensive and carefully maintained. They weren't mass-produced items you could easily replace if lost or damaged. The transition from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age had been gradual in Israel, and iron tools still represented significant investment. A good axe might cost several days' wages for an ordinary labourer. For a student prophet, likely supported by the generosity of others and focused on spiritual rather than material pursuits, such a tool was far beyond his means to purchase. Borrowing the axe wasn't just a casual favour between friends. It was a serious responsibility, a trust that carried moral and financial weight. The lender had placed confidence in this young man's character and ability to care for a valuable tool. To lose or damage it would bring not only financial burden, but also shame and damaged relationships within the community. The young man worked diligently, perhaps even more carefully than usual, acutely aware of the responsibility he carried. The axe felt good in his hands, well balanced, sharp, effective. Each swing brought down chips of wood as he worked to shape a beam for their new dwelling. The rhythm of the work was almost meditative. Lift, aim, strike, lift, aim, strike. Then it happened. Mid-swing, with no warning, the iron head of the axe flew off the handle. The wooden shaft, suddenly lightened, completed its arc uselessly through the air, while the heavy iron head traced a different trajectory entirely. Time seemed to slow as the young man watched in horror as the precious tool spun through the air and landed with a splash in the muddy waters of the Jordan. Alas, my master, it was borrowed! The cry escaped his lips before he could stop it, a wail of despair that carried all the weight of his predicament. This wasn't merely an inconvenience or a temporary setback. This was a crisis that threatened his integrity, his relationships, and his financial future. The Jordan River at this point wasn't like a clear mountain stream, where you might hope to spot a lost item on the bottom. Fed by tributaries from the hill country, it carried sediment and silt that made the water murky and opaque. The riverbed was soft mud, perfect for swallowing a heavy piece of iron and holding it fast. Even if the water had been crystal clear, the iron head would have sunk quickly into the soft bottom, possibly disappearing entirely into the muck. The other workers had stopped their labour at the sound of his cry. Elisha, who had been moving among them, observing the work and encouraging the labourers, turned his attention to the young man's distress. Here was a scene that any leader would recognise. a moment when accident and circumstance converge to create a problem that seems insurmountable. For the young man, the calculations were stark and frightening. How long would he need to work to earn enough to replace the axe? How could he face the man who had trusted him with this valuable tool? What would this mean for his standing in the community of prophets? The borrowed axe represented more than just iron and wood. It was a symbol of trust, responsibility, and his place in the community. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present. Here they were, working to build a place for spiritual learning and growth, and yet they faced an utterly practical, mundane problem. There was no theological complexity here, no deep spiritual mystery to unravel. Just a young man, a borrowed tool, and the murky waters of an ancient river. Standing there on the bank, staring at the spot where the ripples were already beginning to fade, the young man faced a moment that would test not only his faith, but his understanding of God's character. Was this the kind of problem that merited divine attention? Did the God who controlled the fate of nations care about one lost axe head? The question hung in the air, like morning mist over the Jordan, waiting for an answer that would surprise everyone present and challenge their assumptions about the scope of God's concern for the details of human life. Elisha approached the distressed young man with the calm demeanour that had become characteristic of his ministry. Where others might have seen an unfortunate accident requiring practical solutions, perhaps organising a group effort to drag the river bottom or beginning calculations about replacement costs, the prophet saw something different entirely. He saw an opportunity for God to reveal his character in the midst of everyday trouble. Where did it fall? Elisha asked simply. There was no rebuke in his voice, no suggestion that the young man had been careless or irresponsible. Just a straightforward question seeking practical information. The prophet's tone carried neither judgment nor dismissal of the problem's seriousness. He understood the weight of borrowed responsibility and the genuine distress it caused when things went wrong. The young man pointed to the spot where the axe head had disappeared beneath the surface. By now, any ripples had long since faded, and the river flowed on as if nothing had happened. To everyone watching, it looked like any other section of the Jordan, muddy water flowing over an invisible bottom, carrying the same sediment and debris as every other part of the river. But Elisha saw it differently. In his spiritual vision, this wasn't just another spot in the river. It was a specific location where God could demonstrate his power and his care for individual needs. The prophet moved with purpose, scanning the riverbank until he found what he was looking for, a suitable piece of wood. What happened next would have seemed almost comical if it weren't so profound. Elisha cut a stick, nothing special, just an ordinary piece of wood from the riverside. He didn't select anything particularly impressive or perform any elaborate ritual over it. It was simply wood, the kind of material they had been working with all morning, as common and unremarkable as anything could be. Then, with the focused intent of someone who knew exactly what he was doing, Elisha threw the stick into the water at the exact spot the young man had indicated. To the observers, it must have seemed like an odd gesture, perhaps the first step in some complex retrieval process they didn't yet understand. But Elisha's action carried the quiet confidence of a man who had learned to cooperate with divine power in the most unexpected ways. What happened next violated every natural law the witnesses understood. The iron axe head, which should have been resting in the mud at the bottom of the river, began to rise. Not slowly, not gradually, but with the buoyant purpose of cork or wood designed to float. The heavy metal broke the surface of the water and bobbed there like a leaf, defying gravity, density, and everything they thought they knew about the natural world. The silence that followed was profound. Even the sounds of the river seemed muted as the group of prophets stared at the impossible sight before them. Iron doesn't float. Everyone knows that. is one of those fundamental facts about the physical world that requires no explanation because it's so obviously true. Yet there it was, unmistakably iron, unmistakably floating, unmistakably real. Elisha's voice broke through their amazement with practical direction. Pick it up. There was no grand speech about the miracle they had just witnessed, no theological explanation of what had occurred, no demand for praise or recognition, just simple, practical instruction to complete the restoration. The young man reached out, his hand probably trembling with a mixture of relief and awe, and lifted the iron axe head from the water. It was solid, real, unchanged, except for its brief defiance of natural law. The crisis was over. The debt was avoided. The trust was preserved. The borrowed tool was restored to its owner's care. But something much more significant than problem solving had just occurred. In those few moments beside the Jordan River, God had revealed something crucial about his character and his relationship with his people. This wasn't a miracle performed for crowds or kings. There were no political implications, no national consequences, no strategic advantages gained. This was simply God caring about one young man's distress over a borrowed tool. The miracle spoke to the heart of divine character, a God who notices when sparrows fall, who knows the number of hairs on each head, who cares about the details that seem insignificant to everyone else. The floating axe head declared that no genuine need is too small for divine attention, no honest trouble too mundane for miraculous intervention. As the young man hefted the restored tool, feeling its familiar weight and balance, the entire community of prophets had received a lesson they would never forget. They had come to the Jordan to cut timber for a building project. They were leaving with something far more valuable, a deeper understanding of the God they served and his intimate involvement in the practical details of their lives. The miracle of the floating axe head resonates through the centuries precisely because it speaks to truths that transcend its humble circumstances. In a world where we often compartmentalise the spiritual and the practical, this story demolishes the artificial barriers we create between sacred and secular concerns. The most striking aspect of this miracle is its ordinariness. God's intervention came not in response to a national crisis or a life-threatening emergency, but to solve an everyday problem that millions of people might face. The young prophet wasn't dying, wasn't facing persecution for his faith, wasn't even engaged in what we might consider particularly spiritual work. He was simply trying to help build a dormitory and had encountered the kind of mishap that makes any honest person's heart sink. This reveals something profound about God's character, his care for the complete range of human experience, not just the dramatic or spiritually significant moments. The God who controls the destiny of nations also notices when his children face embarrassment, financial stress, or the weight of broken trust. There's no problem too small, no concern too mundane, no worry too insignificant to merit his attention. The symbolism of Elisha's intervention method is equally meaningful. The prophet used a stick, one of the most common humble materials imaginable. He didn't employ exotic implements, rare metals, or elaborate ceremonies. Just wood thrown into water, the kind of action that in any other context would seem pointless or even foolish. This speaks to God's pattern of working through humble means to accomplish extraordinary purposes. Throughout Scripture, God consistently chooses the simple to confound the wise, the weak to overcome the strong, the ordinary to achieve the extraordinary. Moses had a staff, David had a sling, Gideon had clay pots and torches, and Elisha had a stick. The message is clear. God's power isn't dependent on impressive tools or elaborate methods. His strength is made perfect in weakness, his glory revealed through the most unlikely instruments. The miracle also serves as a powerful picture of restoration. What was lost was recovered. What seemed gone forever was returned. What threatened to bring shame and financial burden was transformed into a testimony of God's faithful care. This speaks to one of humanity's deepest needs, the longing for redemption, for second chances, for the restoration of what has been damaged or lost. In the broader context of human experience, we all have borrowed things that we've lost or damaged: trust, opportunities, relationships, innocence, time. We all face moments when we stare at the metaphorical muddy water where something precious has disappeared, feeling the weight of responsibility we can't fulfill. The floating axe head whispers hope into those moments, suggesting that restoration is possible, that what seems irretrievably lost can be recovered. The response required of the young man is also significant. When the miracle occurred, he still had to reach out and take the floating iron. God provided the supernatural intervention, but human cooperation was still necessary. The axe head floated, but it didn't jump back onto the handle by itself. This reflects the general pattern of divine human cooperation throughout Scripture. God provides what only He can provide, but humans must still act in faith to appropriate His provision. Faith in action is another crucial theme woven through this narrative. The young man's cry for help wasn't a formal prayer with proper theological language. It was a raw expression of distress that nevertheless carried implicit faith that his predicament mattered to God and to God's representative, Elisha. His willingness to point out exactly where the axe head fell demonstrated trust that something could be done, even when the situation looked hopeless. Elisha's calm confidence throughout the episode reveals the prophet's deep understanding of God's character and ways. He didn't hesitate, didn't doubt, didn't suggest alternative solutions. He simply asked where the iron fell, and then acted with the assurance of someone who knew he served a God of intimate concern and unlimited power. The miracle also highlights the value of community and leadership. The young man wasn't facing his crisis alone. He was surrounded by fellow believers and guided by a seasoned prophet. Sometimes God's miraculous provision comes through the community of faith, through leaders who see possibilities where others see only problems, through the collective faith of those who believe God cares about every aspect of our lives. Perhaps most importantly, the floating axe head demonstrates that God's miracles often meet practical needs rather than serving merely as spectacular displays of power. This wasn't a miracle performed to convince skeptics or to showcase divine ability. It was a miracle of compassion, addressing a real need in the life of a faithful but distressed young man. It suggests that many of God's interventions in our lives might be similarly practical and personal rather than dramatic and public. The miracle of the floating axe head speaks across the millennia with surprising relevance to our contemporary struggles and concerns. In our age of complex problems and global crises, this ancient story reminds us that faith begins with trusting God in the small things, the everyday challenges that rarely make headlines but profoundly impact our daily lives. The first and perhaps most important lesson concerns the scope of prayer and divine concern. How many times do we hesitate to bring our smaller problems to God because they seem insignificant compared to global suffering or major life crises? The floating axe head shatters this false hierarchy of divine attention. If God cares enough to make iron float for a borrowed tool, then no legitimate concern is too small for prayer. This doesn't trivialize prayer or reduce it to a cosmic vending machine for convenience. Rather, it reveals the intimate nature of our relationship with the divine. Just as loving parents care about both the major milestones and the minor disappointments in their children's lives, our Heavenly Father is interested in the full spectrum of our human experience. Financial stress, damaged relationships, professional setbacks, personal failures, all of these matter to God because they matter to us. The principle of integrity and accountability that runs through this story remains powerfully relevant in our modern context. The young prophet's distress wasn't primarily about losing money, it was about failing to fulfill his responsibility to someone who had trusted him. In a culture where personal accountability is often diminished and broken commitments are easily rationalized away, the ancient prophet's anguish over a borrowed tool offers a compelling counterexample. When we borrow, we incur genuine responsibility. When we make commitments, we create legitimate expectations in others. When we fail to fulfill these obligations, we damage more than our own interests. We harm relationships, erode trust, and diminish the social fabric that holds communities together. The young prophet understood this instinctively, which is why his cry for help carried such genuine distress. The story also demonstrates how God's miracles often meet practical needs rather than serving merely as spectacular demonstrations of power. In our entertainment-driven culture, we sometimes expect divine intervention to be dramatic, public, and unmistakably supernatural. But many of God's most meaningful interventions in our lives might be much quieter and more practical. The unexpected job opportunity that comes just when finances are stretched thin, the chance encounter that provides exactly the encouragement we needed, the solution that appears to an intractable problem. These interventions might not violate physical laws as dramatically as floating iron, but they reveal the same divine character, a God who cares about our practical needs and works in our circumstances to provide for them. Learning to recognize and appreciate these quieter miracles can transform our perspective on God's activity in our lives. The method of the miracle, using a simple stick to accomplish the impossible, continues to speak to God's pattern of working through humble means. In our technology-obsessed age, we often assume that bigger problems require more sophisticated solutions. The floating axe head reminds us that God's power isn't constrained by the impressiveness of our tools or the complexity of our methods. This has profound implications for how we approach problems, both personal and social. Sometimes the most effective solutions are the simplest ones. Sometimes the most powerful interventions come through the most ordinary means. The stick that Elisha threw into the Jordan wasn't impressive, but it was available, and God used it to accomplish the impossible. The story encourages us to bring our authentic selves and genuine problems to God without feeling the need to dress them up in spiritual language or make them sound more significant than they are. The young prophet's cry, "Alas, my master," it was borrowed, contained no theological sophistication, no proper prayer format, no spiritual jargon. It was simply an honest expression of distress from someone who believed his problem mattered to God and to God's representative. In our prayer lives, we sometimes feel pressure to make our requests sound sufficiently spiritual or theologically correct. The floating axe head suggests that God values authenticity over eloquence, genuine need over religious rhetoric. He understands our distress even when we can't articulate it perfectly, and he responds to the heart behind our words, rather than their theological precision. The communal aspect of the miracle also offers important insights for contemporary faith communities. The young prophet wasn't facing his crisis in isolation. He was surrounded by fellow believers and guided by experienced leadership. When problems arise, the community of faith should be a place where burdens are shared, wisdom is offered, and faith is strengthened through mutual support. Too often, we try to handle our difficulties alone, either from pride, embarrassment, or a mistaken belief that faith means never needing help. The sons of the prophets model a different approach, a community where needs could be expressed, help could be sought, and miracles could be witnessed together. This kind of authentic community creates an environment where God's provision can be both sought and celebrated corporately. Finally, the story reminds us that faith often requires us to act even when we don't understand the mechanism of God's provision. The young man still had to reach out and pick up the floating iron. He couldn't fully comprehend how iron could float, but he could respond to the miracle by accepting what God had provided. In our lives, we frequently face situations where we must act on faith without complete understanding of how God will work out the details. The floating axe head encourages us to focus on obedience and trust rather than demanding comprehensive explanations before we're willing to move forward. Sometimes the miracle becomes visible only as we step out in faith to receive what God has already provided. As we close this exploration of one of Scripture's most overlooked miracles, it's worth reflecting on why such a seemingly small event earned its place in the biblical narrative. In a book filled with the dramatic interventions of an almighty God, seas parting, walls falling, armies defeated, why does the story of one floating piece of iron deserve 6 verses in 2 Kings? The answer lies in what this miracle reveals about the God we serve and his relationship with his people. While the parting of the Red Sea demonstrated God's power to save nations, and the fall of Jericho showed his ability to conquer enemies, the floating axe head reveals something equally important but more intimate: his attention to individual needs and personal crises. This forgotten miracle has been overlooked precisely because it's so humble, so ordinary in its context, so focused on solving a simple human problem rather than achieving strategic objectives or demonstrating spectacular power. But perhaps that's exactly why it's so important. It serves as a counterbalance to our tendency to assume that God is only interested in the big things, the major decisions, the life-changing moments, the dramatic interventions that make compelling stories. The young prophet facing his borrowed axe head crisis represents all of us in those moments when we feel overwhelmed by problems that might seem insignificant to others but loom large in our personal experience. The financial burden we can't meet, the relationship we've damaged, the commitment we can't fulfill, the mistake that threatens to bring consequences we can't bear, the responsibility we've failed to handle properly. In these moments, the floating axe head whispers a profound truth. God sees, God cares, and God acts. Not always in the ways we expect, not always with the timing we prefer, not always through the means we would choose, but always with the same loving attention to our genuine needs and distress. The miracle also stands as a testament to the power of authentic community and spiritual leadership. Elisha didn't dismiss the young man's problem as trivial or suggest that he simply accept the consequences and learn from his mistake. Instead, the prophet engaged with the crisis as if it mattered deeply, which to the person experiencing it certainly did. This models the kind of leadership and community that makes faith communities truly supportive rather than merely social. When someone faces a crisis, even one that might seem small from the outside, the appropriate response is compassionate engagement, not dismissive advice or spiritual platitudes that minimize the real impact of the problem. The stick that Elisha threw into the Jordan has become across the centuries a symbol of God's willingness to work through the most ordinary means to accomplish extraordinary purposes. It reminds us that miracles don't always require impressive staging or elaborate preparation. Sometimes they happen through simple acts of faith, using whatever materials are at hand, in response to genuine need expressed with authentic desperation. As we navigate our own challenges, financial pressures, damaged relationships, professional setbacks, personal failures, the floating axe head offers both comfort and challenge. Comfort in knowing that our problems, however humble they might seem, matter to God. Challenge in trusting Him to work in ways we might not expect or understand, using means we might not have chosen, through community we might not have anticipated. The young prophet left the Jordan River that day with more than a recovered tool. He carried with him a testimony of God's intimate care, a story that would strengthen his faith through future challenges, and a deeper understanding of the God he served. His fellow students witnessed not just a miracle, but a revelation of divine character that would shape their own ministries and their own relationship with the Almighty. Perhaps most importantly, the floating axe head reminds us to pay attention to God's activity in the ordinary moments of our lives. If we're only looking for dramatic interventions and spectacular displays of power, we might miss the quieter miracles happening all around us, the practical provisions, the timely encouragements, the unexpected solutions to everyday problems. The iron that floated in the Jordan River that day has long since returned to dust, but the truth it demonstrated remains as solid as ever. God's care extends to every aspect of human experience. No genuine need is too small for His attention, and no problem is too ordinary for His miraculous intervention. In a world that often feels divided between the spiritual and the practical, the sacred and the secular, the significant and the trivial, the floating axe head bridges all these false divisions. It declares that the God who spoke the universe into existence also cares when His children lose borrowed tools, face financial embarrassment, or struggle with the weight of unfulfilled responsibility. If God can make iron float, what's truly impossible? The question echoes across the centuries, challenging our assumptions about divine limitation and inviting us to bring our authentic needs, however humble they might seem, to the one who specialises in doing the impossible through the most ordinary means. The miracle you've never heard of might just be the one you need most to hear. Hello there, dear listeners. Before we begin tonight's tale, I hope your day has treated you kindly, wherever you may be in this vast world of ours. Perhaps it's evening where you are, or maybe the quiet hours of early morning have found you seeking rest. Whether you're listening from bustling cities or peaceful countryside, from mountain peaks or seaside shores, know that you're welcome here in this sacred space we've created together. If you find comfort in these stories, please consider subscribing to Sacred Slumber, where we gather each night to explore the timeless truths that have guided humanity through the ages. Tonight, we journey back through the mists of time to ancient Babylon, to a night when the very finger of the divine wrote upon palace walls, and an empire learned that no earthly power stands beyond the reach of heaven's justice. The year was 539, before the Common Era, and the great city of Babylon sprawled along the banks of the Euphrates River like a jewel cast upon the earth. Within its towering walls, the hanging gardens cascaded in verdant terraces. The Tower of Babel reached toward the heavens, and the palace of King Belshazzar gleamed with the accumulated wealth of conquered nations. On this particular evening, As the sun painted the western sky in shades of gold and crimson, the palace hummed with preparation for a feast unlike any other. Servants scurried through corridors lined with glazed brick murals depicting lions and dragons, carrying platters of delicacies from every corner of the known world. The finest wines from the hills of Judah, exotic spices from distant India, and fruits that glistened like precious stones filled the tables. King Belshazzar, grandson of the great Nebuchadnezzar, had spared no expense. The banquet hall stretched vast as a temple, its ceiling supported by columns carved from single blocks of marble, each one telling the story of Babylonian conquest and glory. Golden lamps suspended on silver chains cast dancing shadows across walls adorned with tapestries, depicting the gods of Babylon in all their imagined splendour. Yet beyond the palace walls, unseen by the revellers within, the armies of Cyrus the Persian stretched across the horizon like a dark sea. For months they had laid siege to the great city, but Babylon's walls had never been breached, her gates never forced. The Babylonians had grown complacent in their strength, confident that their city was impregnable, their empire eternal. As night fell and torches blazed to life throughout the city, 1,000 noble guests made their way through the palace gates. They came dressed in silk and purple, adorned with gold and precious stones, their laughter echoing through the corridors as they anticipated the evening's pleasures. The sound of lyres and flutes drifted through the warm air, mingling with the voices of singers whose melodies spoke of victory and endless prosperity. King Belshazzar himself appeared resplendent in robes of deepest blue, a golden crown upon his brow, rings flashing on his fingers as he gestured grandly to his guests. He was a man in the prime of life, his beard oiled and perfumed, his eyes bright with wine and confidence. This night, he had declared, would be remembered for generations as the greatest feast Babylon had ever witnessed. But even as the celebration reached its crescendo, even as the wine flowed like water and the music swelled to fill every corner of the vast hall, dark currents moved beneath the surface of the evening's joy. For this was not merely a feast, but an act of defiance against the very heavens themselves. As the evening wore on, and the wine loosened tongues and lowered inhibitions, King Belshazzar rose from his golden throne, swaying slightly, as he surveyed the sea of faces before him. The hall fell gradually silent, 1,000 conversations dying away, as all eyes turned toward their sovereign. In the flickering lamplight, his face bore an expression of cruel amusement, as if he harboured some secret that would shock and delight his guests. "My lords and ladies," he called out, his voice carrying easily across the vast space, "tonight we celebrate not merely the glory of Babylon, but the supremacy of our gods over all the earth. We have conquered nations, we have humbled kings, and we have taken the treasures of their temples as trophies of our victories." A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd. Many of the nobles present had been part of those conquests, had seen the wealth of distant lands flow into Babylon's coffers. They raised their goblets in salute, the wine within glinting like liquid rubies in the torchlight. But Belshazzar was not finished. His eyes gleamed with a dangerous light as he continued, "Yet there is one treasure, taken from one temple, that we have never properly honoured. Tonight that changes." He clapped his hands, and servants appeared as if from nowhere, carrying between them objects that made the assembled nobles gasp in recognition and wonder. These were vessels of pure gold and silver, wrought with such exquisite craftsmanship that they seemed to glow within a light. Cups and bowls, pitchers and goblets, each one a masterpiece of the metalworker's art. These were the sacred vessels of Solomon's temple in Jerusalem, taken by Nebuchadnezzar when he conquered that holy city decades before. They had been stored away in the temple of Marduk, treated with the respectful caution due to objects sacred to another people's god. But tonight, under the influence of wine and the intoxication of power, Belshazzar had decided to make them part of his feast. "Behold," the king proclaimed, lifting one of the golden goblets high above his head, "the vessels of the God of the Jews, who could not protect his own temple from our armies, whose people even now languish in exile throughout our empire. Tonight we drink from these cups and show all the world which gods truly hold dominion over the earth." The crowd erupted in cheers and applause, though some of the older nobles shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They remembered the strange stories told about the Hebrew god, the plagues that had befallen Egypt, the walls of Jericho falling at the blast of trumpets. But wine and peer pressure overcame their caution, and soon they too were caught up in the moment's enthusiasm. Servants moved through the hall, distributing the sacred vessels among the guests. Belshazzar himself took the largest of the golden goblets, a magnificent piece that had once held wine, blessed by the priests of the Most High God. He filled it to the brim with the finest vintage from his royal cellars, the red wine dark as blood in the sacred cup. "To Marduk, chief of our gods," he cried, raising the goblet high, "who gives us victory over all our enemies." The assembled throng raised their own sacred vessels, taken from the very altar of the Lord. "To Marduk," they chorused, their voices echoing off the marble walls. But Belshazzar was not content with honouring just one deity. As the evening progressed and the wine continued to flow, he led toast after toast, each one more blasphemous than the last. "To the gods of gold," he proclaimed, and the crowd drank deeply from vessels that had once held the showbread of the temple. "To the gods of silver," he continued, as goblets that had caught the blood of sacrifices now brimmed with Babylonian wine. "To the gods of bronze and iron," the king shouted, his voice growing hoarser with each proclamation. "To the gods of wood and stone, who have made Babylon the greatest empire the world has ever seen." With each toast the revelry grew wilder, the laughter louder, the dancing more frenzied. Noble ladies spun in their silk gowns, their jewellery catching the lamplight as they moved. Men struck up drinking songs, their voices blending in harmony that spoke of triumph and excess. The very air seemed thick with incense and wine fumes, creating an atmosphere of decadent celebration. But high above the palace, in the courts of heaven, other eyes watched this display of pride and blasphemy. The sacred vessels, fashioned for the worship of the one true God, profaned by lips that praised idols of metal and wood. The moment had come for divine justice to make itself known upon the earth. It was in the midst of the wildest revelry, as the feast reached its crescendo of blasphemous celebration, that the atmosphere in the great hall began to change. At first it was subtle, a gradual shift that few noticed amid the chaos of music and laughter. The temperature seemed to drop slightly, though the braziers still burned brightly, and the press of bodies should have kept the air warm. A strange stillness crept into the room, not the absence of sound, but something deeper, as if the very air had grown heavy with an unseen presence. King Belshazzar stood near his throne, swaying slightly from the effects of wine, his golden goblet raised in yet another toast to the gods of Babylon. His nobles surrounded him, their faces flushed with drink and excitement, sacred vessels clutched in their hands as they prepared to echo their sovereign's words. The musicians played with passionate intensity, their instruments weaving melodies that spoke of earthly glory and endless prosperity. And then, in the space of a single heartbeat, everything changed. The music faltered first, not as if the musicians had stopped playing, but as if the very air had grown too thick to carry their melodies. Conversations died mid-sentence, laughter cut off as abruptly as if severed by a blade. Even the flickering flames of the lamps seemed to burn lower, their light growing dim and uncertain. It was then that someone screamed. The cry came from a noble woman near the eastern wall, her voice sharp with terror as her trembling finger pointed upward. Every head in the vast hall turned to follow her gaze, and what they saw there drove the colour from their faces and the strength from their limbs. There, upon the wall directly opposite the king's throne, a human hand had appeared, not attached to any arm or body, but suspended in the air as if emerging from the very substance of eternity itself. The hand was illuminated by its own light, pale and ghostly, yet undeniably real, casting shadows that danced across the painted murals of Babylonian gods. The fingers were long and elegant, neither young nor old, but possessed of a timeless quality that spoke of power beyond human understanding. They moved with deliberate precision, as if guided by a will that brooked no resistance, no hesitation. And as the assembled throng watched in growing horror, those fingers began to write. The writing appeared as lines of fire upon the polished marble, each character burning itself into the stone with the permanence of divine judgment. The script was unlike any earthly language, neither Babylonian cuneiform nor Hebrew letters, but something older and more fundamental, as if the very essence of meaning was being carved directly into reality itself. King Belshazzar felt his knees begin to shake, his golden goblet slipping from nerveless fingers to shatter upon the floor. The sacred vessel that moments before had held wine, offered in mockery to false gods, now lay broken, its precious contents spreading like blood across the marble. His face, so recently flushed with wine and arrogance, had gone pale as death, his eyes wide with a terror he had never before experienced. The hand continued its work, unmoved by the chaos it had caused in the hall below. Characters appeared one after another, each one blazing within a fire before settling into a steady glow that seemed to penetrate the very souls of all who looked upon it. The writing was clear and bold, demanding attention, impossible to ignore or dismiss. Around the hall, the reaction was immediate and visceral. Some of the nobles had fallen to their knees, whether from terror or instinctive reverence, it was impossible to say. Others pressed against the walls, as if trying to escape through solid stone, their eyes never leaving the supernatural display before them. The sacred vessels of Solomon's temple lay scattered across the floor, abandoned by hands that now trembled too violently to hold them. The musicians had long since set down their instruments, their faces pale masks of fear. Servants cowered in doorways, torn between the desire to flee and their duty to remain. The dancing girls who moments before had spun and laughed now stood frozen like statues, their silk scarves trailing forgotten around their feet. But it was upon King Belshazzar that the greatest terror fell. As the ruler who had ordered the profanation of the sacred vessels, as the one who had led the blasphemous toasts, he felt the weight of divine displeasure focusing upon him like the heat of a burning glass. His crown, so recently a symbol of earthly power, now felt heavy as lead upon his brow. His royal robes, dyed in the finest purples and blues, seemed to hang upon him like grave clothes. The hand finished its work and faded from view as suddenly as it had appeared, leaving behind only the words burning upon the wall like coals of fire. But even in its absence, the presence that had guided it remained, filling the hall with an atmosphere of judgment that made every breath a struggle. Silence reigned in the great banquet hall of Babylon, broken only by the occasional sob or whispered prayer. The greatest feast in the empire's history had become a scene of terror and divine revelation, and upon the wall, where gods and heroes had been painted in their imagined glory, 4 words now blazed with the fire of heaven's judgment. Mene, Mene, Tekel, Parsin. In the awful silence that followed the hand's disappearance, King Belshazzar stood transfixed, his gaze locked upon the burning words that seemed to sear themselves deeper into his consciousness with each passing moment. The weight of divine judgment pressed down upon the hall like a physical force, and the king's breath came in short, sharp gasps, as if the very air had grown too thin to sustain life. Gradually, as the initial shock began to wear off, the practical reality of the situation asserted itself. Here were words written by a supernatural hand, clearly intended as some form of message or warning, but their meaning remained utterly mysterious. The script was unlike anything in the libraries of Babylon, the characters seeming to shift and dance, even as they maintained their fixed positions upon the wall. "The wise men," Belshazzar managed to croak, his voice barely recognisable. "Summon all the wise men of Babylon, every magician, every astrologer, every diviner in the city. Bring them here at once." His command galvanised the paralysed servants into action. They scattered like leaves before a wind, grateful for any excuse to leave the presence of those terrifying words. Throughout the palace and into the city they ran, pounding upon doors and rousing from sleep the learned men whose wisdom had served the empire for generations. The first to arrive were the court magicians, men whose elaborate robes and mystical instruments had earned them places of honour at royal ceremonies. They entered the banquet hall with confidence, their heads held high and their voices ready with the usual formulas of greeting and flattery. But one look at the writing upon the wall, one glimpse of those characters that seemed to burn within a fire, and their confidence evaporated like mist before the sun. They approached the wall cautiously, their heads tilted at various angles as they studied the mysterious script. They consulted ancient tablets and scrolls, compared the characters to every known form of writing, whispered incantations and cast lots according to their various arts. But though they laboured long into the night, turning the problem over from every conceivable angle, they could make no sense of the divine message. The astrologers came next, men who claimed to read the future in the movements of stars and planets. They examined the writing with instruments of bronze and silver, measuring the angles and proportions of each character as if they were constellations written across the heavens. They calculated and computed, referenced their star charts, and consulted their ancient tables, but the meaning of the words remained as hidden as the dark side of the moon. As the hours passed, more and more of Babylon's learned men arrived at the palace, priests of Marduk and Ishtar, scholars who had studied in the great libraries, men whose reputations for wisdom extended throughout the known world. Each group brought their own methods and their own certainty that they would succeed where others had failed. Yet one by one, they too were forced to admit defeat before the mystery of the burning words. King Belshazzar grew increasingly desperate as each attempt failed. He paced before his throne like a caged lion, his robes dishevelled and his crown askew. The sacred vessels of Solomon's temple lay scattered and forgotten across the floor, their golden surfaces reflecting the supernatural light from the wall in fractured gleams that hurt the eyes to look upon. "Gold," the king proclaimed suddenly, his voice cracking with strain. "I will give gold beyond counting to whoever can read these words. Silver and precious stones, lands and titles, whatever they desire shall be theirs." But even the promise of unlimited wealth could not unlock the meaning of heaven's message. The wise men huddled together in small groups, whispering their theories and hypotheses, but none dared claim understanding of what clearly lay beyond human comprehension. It was then, as the night wore on toward dawn and desperation reached its peak, that a new figure entered the banquet hall. She was an elderly woman, her hair white as snow, but her back still straight and her eyes bright with intelligence. This was Nitocris, the Queen Mother, widow of Nebuchadnezzar and grandmother to Belshazzar himself. She had heard the commotion from her private quarters, had seen the servants running through the corridors, and felt the strange oppression that seemed to hang over the entire palace. Now she made her way through the crowd of baffled wise men, her presence commanding respect even in the midst of chaos. "My Lord King," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the hall, despite her advanced years. "I see that you are troubled, that the colour has left your face and your limbs shake with fear. Do not let your thoughts alarm you, and do not look so pale." Belshazzar turned toward her, her hope flickering in his eyes like a candle flame in a dark room. "Grandmother, you have seen much in your long life. You were wife to great Nebuchadnezzar. You know the secrets of the empire. Can you tell me what these words mean?" The Queen Mother approached the wall, studying the burning characters with the careful attention of one who had witnessed many supernatural events during her husband's reign. "I cannot read these words, my grandson," she said at length, "but I know of one who might." She turned back to face the assembly, her aged voice somehow carrying more authority than all the learned men combined. "There is a man in your kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. In the days of your grandfather, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. King Nebuchadnezzar appointed him chief of the magicians, enchanters, Chaldeans, and astrologers." A murmur ran through the crowd at these words. Many of the older nobles remembered stories from Nebuchadnezzar's time, tales of a Hebrew exile who had interpreted dreams and solved mysteries that baffled all others. But in the years since the great king's death, this man had faded from prominence, forgotten in the new reign's focus on younger advisers. "This man Daniel," the Queen Mother continued, "whom the king named Belteshazzar, has an excellent spirit, knowledge, and understanding to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve problems. Let Daniel be called, and he will tell you what the writing means." As the name Daniel echoed through the hall, Belshazzar felt a mixture of hope and apprehension. He had heard the stories, knew of the Hebrew's reputation for wisdom and divine favour, but he also knew that Daniel had served his grandfather faithfully and might not be inclined to help the king who had dishonoured the vessels of his people's God. Nevertheless, desperation overcame pride, and Belshazzar gave the command, "Find Daniel the Hebrew, bring him here immediately. If he can read these words, he shall be clothed in purple and have a chain of gold around his neck, and he shall be the third ruler in the kingdom." As servants rushed to obey this new command, the burning words continued to glow upon the wall, patient as eternity, waiting for the one who had been chosen to unlock their meaning and pronounce the doom of Babylon. The dawn was breaking over Babylon when Daniel arrived at the palace, summoned from sleep by urgent messengers, who spoke in hushed, fearful tones of supernatural writing and royal desperation. He was an old man now, his beard white with age and his face marked by the lines of many years spent in faithful service to foreign kings. Yet his eyes remained clear and bright, reflecting a wisdom that came not from human learning, but from communion with the eternal God. As he entered the banquet hall, Daniel paused for a moment to take in the scene before him. The remnants of the great feast lay scattered about like the debris of a broken dream. Golden plates and silver cups, many of them the sacred vessels of Solomon's temple, littered the floor, among pools of spilled wine and trampled delicacies. The nobles who had revelled so wildly just hours before now stood in small frightened groups, their fine clothes dishevelled and their faces pale with terror. But it was the writing upon the wall that commanded his attention, those 4 words blazing with divine fire that no earthly wisdom could extinguish. Daniel looked upon them without fear, for he recognised the hand that had written them, and he understood that he stood in the presence of the Almighty's judgment. King Belshazzar approached him with hasty, desperate steps, his royal dignity forgotten in his need for answers. "Are you Daniel, one of the exiles from Judah, whom my grandfather the king brought from Judah?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "I have heard of you. that the spirit of the gods is in you, and that light and understanding and excellent wisdom are found in you." The king gestured toward the wall with a trembling hand. "Now the wise men and enchanters have been brought in before me to read this writing and make known to me its interpretation, but they could not show the interpretation of the matter. But I have heard that you can give interpretations and solve problems. Now if you can read the writing and make known to me its interpretation, you shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around your neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom." Daniel listened to these promises of wealth and power with the patience of one who had seen empires rise and fall, who had served in the courts of kings and understood the vanity of earthly honours. When Belshazzar finished speaking, the old prophet's response came with quiet authority that somehow filled the vast hall more completely than the king's desperate entreaties. "Let your gifts be for yourself, and give your rewards to another," Daniel said, his voice calm and steady in the face of royal panic. "Nevertheless, I will read the writing to the king and make known to him the interpretation." But before he would interpret the supernatural message, Daniel had words of his own to speak, words that cut to the heart of the night's blasphemous revelry, and laid bare the spiritual rebellion that had brought divine judgment upon Babylon. "O king," he began, his voice growing stronger as he spoke, "the Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar your grandfather kingship, and greatness, and glory, and majesty. And because of the greatness that he gave him, all peoples, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him. Whom he would, he killed, and whom he would, he kept alive. Whom he would, he raised up, and whom he would, he humbled." The assembled nobles listened in growing discomfort as Daniel recounted the story they all knew but preferred to forget. Nebuchadnezzar's pride, his claim to have built Babylon by his own power and for his own glory, and the terrible judgment that followed. How the great king had been driven from among men to live like a beast in the wilderness, eating grass like an ox, and letting his hair grow long as eagle's feathers and his nails like birds' claws. But when his heart was lifted up, and his spirit was hardened so that he dealt proudly, Daniel continued, his eyes never leaving Belshazzar's face, he was brought down from his kingly throne, and his glory was taken from him. He was driven from among the children of mankind, and his mind was made like that of a beast, and his dwelling was with the wild donkeys. He was fed grass like an ox, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, until he knew that the Most High God rules the kingdom of mankind, and sets over it whom he will. The silence in the hall was absolute as Daniel paused, letting the weight of his words sink into the hearts of all who heard them. Then, with the authority of one who spoke for the God of heaven, he delivered his devastating rebuke. "And you, his son, Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, though you knew all this," he declared, his voice now ringing with prophetic power. "But you have lifted up yourself against the Lord of heaven, and the vessels of his house have been brought in before you, and you and your lords, your wives, and your concubines have drunk wine from them. And you have praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood and stone, which do not see or hear or know, but the God in whose hand is your breath, and whose are all your ways you have not honoured." Each word fell upon the assembled company like blows from a hammer, shattering their illusions of security and exposing the full extent of their rebellion against the Most High. Belshazzar himself seemed to shrink before Daniel's accusing words, his royal robes hanging loose about his diminished frame, his crown sitting askew upon a head bowed with shame and terror. The sacred vessels lay scattered around the hall like silent witnesses to the truth of Daniel's words. These cups and bowls, crafted for the worship of the one true God, had been defiled by lips that praised idols of metal and stone. The wine that had flowed so freely in blasphemous toasts, now seemed to accuse those who had drunk it. Its red stains upon the marble floor, like drops of blood that cried out for justice. Then from his presence the hand was sent, Daniel concluded, pointing toward the burning words upon the wall, and this writing was inscribed. The hall remained wrapped in profound silence, as all waited to hear the interpretation that would seal Babylon's fate. The wise men who had laboured through the night stood humbled before this Hebrew exile who had succeeded where they had failed. The nobles who had revelled in their blasphemy now cowered before the prospect of divine judgment. And King Belshazzar, who had thought himself secure in his power, waited to hear the doom that had been written by the finger of God upon his palace wall. Daniel turned from the cowering king to face the wall where the divine words blazed with undiminished fire. The characters seemed to pulse within a light, each one carrying the weight of heaven's judgment and the certainty of prophetic fulfillment. In the profound silence of the great hall, the aged prophet lifted his voice and began to speak the words that would seal the fate of the Babylonian Empire. "And this is the writing that was inscribed," Daniel announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the vast space. "Many, many tekel and parsin." He paused, allowing the strange words to echo through the hall, their sounds somehow both foreign and familiar, like a half-remembered dream that carries portents of future sorrow. The assembled nobles leaned forward despite their fear, desperate to understand the message that had struck such terror into their hearts. "This is the interpretation of the matter," Daniel continued, his aged voice gaining strength as he spoke for the God of heaven. "Mene, God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end." The first word fell upon the assembly like a death sentence. Here was the divine accountant taking inventory of Belshazzar's reign, counting each day of blasphemy and rebellion, each moment of pride and defiance against the Most High. The king's face went even paler, if such a thing were possible, and several of the nobles gasped aloud at the finality of the pronouncement. But Daniel was not finished. The second judgment followed hard upon the first, each word a hammer blow against the foundations of Babylonian pride. "Tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and found wanting." Here was the divine judge placing Belshazzar's reign, his character, his very soul, upon the perfect scales of heaven's justice. And the verdict was damning beyond appeal. Found wanting, found lacking, found insufficient when measured against the standards of righteousness and truth. The king, who had thought himself great in his own eyes, was revealed to be nothing more than a feather in the balance when weighed against divine holiness. Belshazzar's knees gave way completely at these words, and he would have fallen had not two of his guards stepped forward to support him. The golden crown tumbled from his head to ring against the marble floor, the sound echoing through the hall like a funeral bell. His royal robes, so recently symbols of power and majesty, now seemed to hang upon him like burial shrouds. "Perez," Daniel proclaimed, using the singular form of the final word, "your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians." The last judgment was perhaps the most terrible of all, for it spoke not merely of the king's personal doom, but of the end of the empire itself. Babylon, the golden head of Nebuchadnezzar's dream, the city that had ruled the world with rod of iron, was to be divided like a carcass among its enemies. The Medes and Persians, even now camped outside the city walls, would soon walk through its gates as conquerors and claim its treasures as their own. A wail of despair went up from some of the assembled nobles as the full weight of the prophecy struck home. They had thought themselves secure behind Babylon's mighty walls, protected by their gods and their armies from any earthly threat. But now they understood that their true enemy was not the Persian host outside their gates, but the God of heaven himself. against whom no wall could stand and no army could prevail. Daniel stood unmoved amid the chaos of fear and lamentation, his weathered face reflecting the sorrow of one who took no pleasure in the pronouncement of judgment, yet understood its necessity. He had served this empire faithfully for decades, had helped to interpret its dreams and solve its mysteries, but he had also watched its gradual descent into pride and blasphemy, its increasing defiance of the God who held its breath in his hands. The Most High God rules in the kingdom of men, he said, his voice cutting through the din of panic and despair. He removes kings and sets up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. He reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what is in the darkness, and the light dwells with him. These words, drawn from his own experience of divine revelation, served as both comfort and warning to all who heard them. Comfort to those who trusted in the sovereign God, for they could be assured that no earthly power could stand against his ultimate purposes, but warning to those who set themselves against heaven's will, for they would surely be brought low in their appointed time. King Belshazzar, supported now by his guards and struggling to maintain even a semblance of royal dignity, looked up at Daniel with eyes haunted by the certainty of doom. Yet even in his extremity, he sought to honour his promise to the man who had solved the mystery that had baffled all his wise men. "Clothe Daniel with purple," he commanded, in a voice barely above a whisper, "and put a chain of gold around his neck, and proclaim that he shall be the third ruler in the kingdom." It was a pathetic gesture, the dying king attempting to bestow honours, even as his kingdom crumbled around him. The purple robe was brought, the golden chain placed around Daniel's neck, but these earthly symbols of power seemed hollow and meaningless in the face of the divine judgment that had been pronounced. Daniel accepted the honours not for their own sake, but as a testimony to the truth of his words. When the people saw that the king himself acknowledged the accuracy of the Hebrew prophet's interpretation, they would know that the doom of Babylon was certain and that the God of Israel was indeed sovereign over all earthly kingdoms. As the purple robes settled around Daniel's aged shoulders and the golden chain caught the light of the supernatural writing on the wall, the contrast could not have been more stark. Here stood a man clothed with earthly honours, yet serving a heavenly king, while around him an empire clothed in pride and blasphemy faced its final hour of judgment. The words on the wall continued to burn with undiminished intensity, their message now fully revealed but their power unabated. They served as a permanent reminder that the kingdoms of this world are temporary, subject to the sovereign will of the God who numbers their days and weighs their deeds in the balance of perfect justice. Even as Daniel spoke his interpretation and received the hollow honours of a doomed king, the wheels of divine judgment were already turning beyond the palace walls. For months the Persian army under Cyrus had maintained their siege of the great city, but the Babylonians had felt secure behind walls that had never been breached by any earthly foe. They had provisions to last for years, abundant water from the Euphrates River, and an unshakable confidence in the strength of their defences. But on this night, a supernatural writing blazed upon the palace wall, and prophecy sealed the empire's fate. Cyrus was putting into motion a plan of breathtaking audacity that would prove that no human fortress can stand against the purposes of the Almighty. The Euphrates River, which flowed through the heart of Babylon and provided both water and transportation for the great city, was also its greatest vulnerability. The river entered the city through massive gates that could be lowered into the water, and it flowed beneath the walls through channels that were thought to be too narrow and well defended for any army to use as an entrance. But Cyrus had spent months studying these defences, and his engineers had been working tirelessly upstream from the city. digging channels and building dams that would allow them to divert the mighty river from its course. The work had been done quietly, secretly, hidden from Babylonian scouts by the darkness of night and the cleverness of Persian engineering. As the banquet hall erupted in chaos at Daniel's interpretation, as nobles fled in terror and servants cowered in corners, the Persian engineers upstream were opening their carefully constructed channels. The waters of the Euphrates, which had flowed through Babylon for centuries, began to turn aside into the new channels that Cyrus had prepared. At first the change was barely noticeable. The river level dropped slowly, gradually, as if affected by nothing more than seasonal variations. But as more water was diverted, as the new channels carried away the river's flow, the level within the city began to drop significantly. By midnight, Persian soldiers were wading through knee-deep water where once the river had flowed deep and strong. They moved silently through the darkness, following the riverbed beneath the great walls of Babylon, their weapons wrapped in cloth to prevent any sound that might alert the guards above. The Babylonian sentries, focused on watching for attacks against the massive gates and towering walls, never thought to look down at the river that had always been their protection. They were drunk on wine from the royal feast, their attention scattered by the strange reports of supernatural writing in the palace, their confidence unshaken by any thought that their impregnable city could fall in a single night. The first Persian soldiers emerged from the river channels near the heart of the city, just as Daniel finished pronouncing his interpretation. While the prophet spoke of kingdoms divided and given to the Medes and Persians, those very conquerors were already inside Babylon's walls, moving swiftly through streets where citizens slept peacefully, unaware that their empire was breathing its last. The palace guards, those few who remained at their posts while most had crowded into the banquet hall to witness the supernatural spectacle, were overwhelmed before they could raise an alarm. Persian steel, sharp and silent in the darkness, found its mark with deadly efficiency. Within minutes, the palace was secured, its approaches controlled by Cyrus's elite troops. In the banquet hall, King Belshazzar was still struggling to comprehend the magnitude of his doom when the great doors burst open and Persian soldiers poured into the room. The nobles, already terrified by the supernatural writing and Daniel's interpretation, now faced the earthly fulfillment of heaven's judgment. Some tried to flee, but found every exit blocked by armed men. Others fell to their knees, begging for mercy that would not come. The sacred vessels of Solomon's temple, scattered across the floor where they had been dropped in blasphemous revelry, now reflected the gleam of Persian bronze and steel in their golden surfaces. Belshazzar himself stood frozen for a moment, the weight of prophecy and the reality of conquest crashing together in his mind like colliding worlds. The writing on the wall blazed with undiminished fire, its message now fulfilled before his very eyes. The Medes and Persians had indeed inherited his kingdom, just as the divine hand had written and Daniel had interpreted. The end came swiftly. Persian soldiers, their orders clear and their duty unwavering, moved through the hall with grim efficiency. King Belshazzar, the ruler who had mocked the God of heaven and profaned his holy vessels, fell beneath Persian swords before the night was through. The golden crown that had tumbled from his head lay forgotten on the marble floor, while his blood mingled with the spilled wine from the sacred goblets. Throughout the great city, the same scene was repeated. Persian forces, having entered through the river channels, swept through Babylon like an irresistible tide. The gates were opened from within, the walls manned by conquerors rather than defenders, the mighty empire brought to its knees in a single night of divine judgment. By dawn, Cyrus's standards flew from the towers of Babylon, and Darius the Mede had been installed as the new ruler of the greatest city in the world. The empire that had seemed eternal, the walls that had appeared impregnable, the power that had dominated the known world for generations, all had fallen before the sovereign will of the God who rules in the kingdoms of men. As the sun rose over conquered Babylon, painting the great city in shades of gold and crimson that seemed somehow fitting for its fall, Daniel stood again before the wall where the supernatural writing continued to glow with divine fire. The banquet hall was empty now, save for the debris of the feast and the silent testimony of judgment fulfilled. Mene, Mene, Tekel, Parsin, the words that had sealed an empire's fate, now served as an eternal reminder of truths that transcend the rise and fall of earthly kingdoms. God had indeed numbered the days of Belshazzar's reign and brought it to an end. The king had been weighed in heaven's perfect scales and found wanting. The kingdom had been divided and given to the Medes and Persians, just as the supernatural hand had written and the faithful prophet had interpreted. The sacred vessels of Solomon's temple, once profaned by blasphemous lips, would soon be restored to their proper place of honour. Under Cyrus's benevolent rule, the Jewish exiles would be free to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple, carrying with them the golden cups and silver bowls that had witnessed both the depths of human pride and the certainty of divine justice. Daniel himself, now clothed in the purple of a dying empire, yet serving the eternal kingdom of heaven, had once again demonstrated that those who trust in the Most High God will never be disappointed. Through him, the sovereignty of the Almighty had been proclaimed in the halls of earthly power, and the vanity of human pride had been exposed for all to see. The lesson of that terrible night echoes through the corridors of history, speaking to every generation that dares to lift itself up against the Lord of heaven. Kingdoms rise and fall like waves upon the shore. Empires that seem eternal prove to be as fleeting as morning mist, but the kingdom of God endures forever. No wall can stand against his purposes, no power can resist his will, no pride can escape his judgments. In our own age, when earthly kingdoms still vie for dominion, and human pride still challenges heaven's authority, the writing on Babylon's wall remains as relevant as ever. We who read these ancient words would do well to remember that the God who humbled Nebuchadnezzar, who numbered Belshazzar's days, who gave Babylon to the Medes and Persians, is the same yesterday, today, and forever. The scales of divine justice still weigh the actions of nations and individuals. The sovereign hand that writes the destiny of empires still guides the course of human history, and the kingdom that Daniel served, the kingdom that outlasted Babylon and Persia and all the empires that followed, remains the only power that will never pass away. As night falls once again over the ancient site where Babylon once stood in all its glory, as stars appear in the darkness above ruins that once housed the pride of earthly kingdoms, the eternal truth proclaimed by that supernatural hand continues to shine with undiminished light. The Most High God rules in the kingdom of men, and blessed are those who humble themselves before his throne. May we who hear this ancient story find in it not merely a tale of judgment long past, but a present reminder of the God who sees all, knows all, and judges all with perfect righteousness. And may we, like Daniel, serve faithfully in whatever earthly kingdom we find ourselves, while keeping our ultimate allegiance to the kingdom that cannot be shaken, the kingdom that endures forever and ever. The writing is on the wall, dear friends. The question that remains is whether we will read it in time to humble ourselves before the King of Kings, or whether we will follow Belshazzar's path to destruction. The choice, as always, is ours to make, is ours to